Okay, this is quarter 4, lesson 3, the Cold War overseas. Last lesson we discussed the Cold War in America, and now we're going to talk about the Cold War and its impact in the rest of the world. After World War II ended, and once the Cold War began, we saw the capitalist democratic countries of America and Western Europe form what we call NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was an alliance. So what that means is that they were very focused on protecting one another. So if one country was attacked, then the others would protect it. After this was established, then the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact. Again, the Warsaw Pact was an alliance. It was between communist nations. So the first concern over the spread of communism was the spread of communism in Asia. And again, we're worried about two theories here, right? The domino theory was once one country fell to communism, other countries would fall. And then the second theory is, again, containment, and that is preventing the spread of communism. So China became communist in 1945 under the leadership of this man right here, Mao Zedong. And he controlled China, like I said, in 1945. He set up the People's Republic of China, which was a communist government. This caused a lot of concern for many people in America. And again, they wanted to make sure that they could try to contain the spread of this communism. The biggest fear with communism was the spread of communism. And this, in fact, became true in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. So over here on the map, we see that North Korea and China share a border. And in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with the support of China. North Korea was communist. They developed that after World War II ended. North Korea was a communist government that was supported by China. And South Korea was supported by the United States and was led by General Douglas MacArthur. We have an elementary school named after him. And they were a democratic society. South Korea was democratic. We were involved in this for 3 years. Still to this day, North Korea and South Korea are divided. And you can see right here the parallel that still divides those two today. If you were to go, it's a military zone. You will see soldiers from both sides that stand along the border and just kind of look at each other as a protection between North Korea and South Korea. And a year after we ended our involvement in Korea, we began our involvement in Vietnam in 1954. And in 1954, very similar to what we saw in Korea, we had North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So here we have Vietnam. And we saw North Vietnam invade South Vietnam. The North was communist. The South was democratic. Again, the northern border shares a border with China. And we were really focused on this idea of containment. How can we stop the spread of communism? We started off the first few years just giving a little bit of military support. And it wasn't until President Johnson became president who greatly expanded troops in the region. And you can see that increase right in here where we really started to increase troops in there, especially in 1968 when we had the highest amount of troops in Vietnam. Not everyone supported the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. And people were very divided over the war. We started to see a strong opposition for the war, especially on college campuses. You can see some images from that over here to the side, that people wanted the war to end. They thought that it wasn't ours to be involved in. We had problems at home. The civil rights movement were taking place. People felt like there was a lot of inequality here that we should be addressing. And so we started to see really strong opposition for the Vietnam War. When President Nixon became president, he started what we call Vietnamization, which was slowly withdrawing American troops and replacing South Vietnam forces while maintaining military aid to South Vietnam. And that was minimally effective. Finally, in 1975, Vietnam was united as a communist country, and essentially, we lost the war. And Vietnam became communist. Now, something that was sadly different between World War II and Vietnam is when World War II veterans returned home, they were seen as heroes, right? They were viewed as heroes. They served the country. People were very proud of them. You can see the picture right here of a homecoming parade. Everyone looks really happy, very excited. They were honored. Whereas with Vietnam, it was very different. They were either faced with indifference, meaning that people just didn't acknowledge that one way or another, or they were faced with pure hostility. The resist the draft, don't register. There was a lot of pressure not to register for the draft. My dad was in college during this time period. He did have a draft number, but was never drafted. And he did say there was a lot of pressure to ditch the draft or to not go if you were drafted. And that was a pretty common sentiment around a lot of people at that time period. So they were not viewed as heroes like World War II, which creates a lot of problems for vets when they come home when they just finished fighting and were treated with such hostility. Finally, the Cold War did come to an end, and it came to an end essentially because the Soviet Union collapsed. So the Soviet Union collapsed for a couple of different reasons. One, they kept trying to increase their expenses to compete with the United States, and they just couldn't. So they could not compete with the United States. Their economy was not strong enough. There was also a rise of nationalism in Soviet republics. So these are countries that the Soviets took over. Started to have a lot of nationalism, meaning that they had pride for their own country, not for the Soviet Union. So that started to create tensions within the Soviet Republic itself. We also saw a lot of change with this idea of capitalism and capitalism expanding. And in the Soviet economy, we saw a lot of inefficiency. This term glasnost and perestroika, I'm going to say that wrong, is openness and economic restructuring under Gorbachev. He was the leader at the time. Here we have Gorbachev and Reagan. At the end of the Cold War. So Gorbachev tried to restructure the economy, and really it led to a lot of economic inefficiencies. And so the Soviet government and economic status just couldn't compete with the United States, which ended up making the Soviet Union dissolve and the Cold War ending. And that is it for this lesson.